G'day and welcome back to the first episode of Talking Leadership TV for September 2023. Our guest today is Penny Johnson, the CEO of the Australian Horizons Foundation. Penny believes it's her responsibility and a great privilege to work with like-minded people towards a positive future for rural and remote Australia. She believes that education is the key and should be available to everyone regardless of their geographic location. Her family was active in agri-politics in New South Wales, sharing the view that if you can help, you should, and if you don't like how something is going, get in and do something about it. She grew up during the extended periods of drought and bushfires while the rural sector bore the brunt of abysmal agriculture policy. Following ag studies at Wagga Wagga, she worked around New South Wales, Queensland and the Northern Territory in agriculture, tourism, zookeeping. She ran a four-wheel drive tour enterprise and entered local government. Penny has been an avid advocate for farming families and remote communities with a focus on policies that enable self-determination and enhance the livelihoods of people beyond the metropolitan areas. She's committed to helping people access services that help improve their well-being. Healthy country and healthy communities are only possible if we all have healthy people. Penny endeavours to connect people and provide a voice for rural communities, while her work enables her to collaborate and raise funds that provide social support following disasters, deliver rural mental health services, bush kids access to education and rural advocacy. She also actively seeks opportunities to help inform policymakers and create change for rural communities, living with the vagaries of nature and struggling under incredibly restrictive legislation, with financial instruments exacerbated by social expectations that are far removed from the reality and practical application of those who work and live in rural and regional communities. Thanks again for joining us on this podcast. But enough from me, and I'll hand over to Penny. So can we start at the beginning by me asking you your leadership and its beginnings, mate?
Well, I think everyone's leadership story really starts probably when they're kids somehow. Everything starts when we're kids, doesn't it? You know, what we're exposed to, what we experience, the people around us, and sometimes, you know, the circumstances that sometimes make us, you know, step up and step out sometimes. So I think I can say I was blessed to grow up in drought. It's not often that you would say that, but I guess it was because that really helped me see how important community is, and how important within that community it is that there are people who actually take on those more visible roles, that actually go and speak and advocate on behalf of the community or on behalf of, you know, a group that's impacted by something. And quite often that's when leadership really, you know, comes to the fore. You know, so whether it's, you know, a services, you know, club that identifies a need within the community, and, you know, they end up with a president, secretary, treasurer. In my family, that quite often ended up being my dad. So, you know, and I think, you know, his dad and, you know, and I think my grandparents on both sides had always said, if you don't like how something's going, or you think someone needs a hand, then sort of, you know, step up and, you know, do something about it, get involved, see how it works, and yeah, and see how you can contribute. So I think Dad and Mum both really led with that example on a whole number of fronts. Mum with the PNC, and quite often, and Pony Club, you know, taking on roles in organising things, and sometimes it was just because, yeah, someone just had to do it, otherwise it wouldn't happen. You know, and if you want something to happen, you know, particularly in rural communities, you know, want something for the kids, then, you know, a few parents get together and go, let's do this. Yeah, and then you find people taking, you know, the lead on something, you know, and therefore you end up with leadership, and people start looking to them because they've developed maybe some skills or capabilities, or they've taken on roles, you know, because that's the position that there's been a gap somewhere, and they've actually either stepped into the breach, or they've actually led the charge, one or the other. So Dad was quite often leading the charge. Mum would step into the breach.
Yeah, it sounds like that you were groomed for this from an early age. And a lot of the guests that I've had in the past, before I switched to the primary video platform now, would talk about their time in either rural or regional communities or in big families where service to the community was something that was important
Mm,
for all the reasons that you've just said, that if you don't get in, no one else will. Leading from behind is not something that you've got the DNA for it. It's more get up and do something and be there up front.
mm,
And it seems like both your mum and dad gave you that platform, and that's a good thing to have had on the come up, particularly as you start thinking about what's a career going to look like, what's your first job going to look like, and whether or not you are happy to be a team member or you want to do something more than that. And
mm,
yeah, I've heard this quite a lot. I didn't quite have the same background, but I did have two strong-willed parents that gave me some good guidance and made me critique what was happening around me. So that I think that helps as you're coming up,
mm.
and we all bring something slightly different to it. Look,
Yes.
Penny, as you started to progress in leadership roles, because you're currently the CEO of Australian Horizons Foundation, what
Mm.
give me some sense, if you can, before we talk about defining leadership, the leaders that you've met in either the rural or regional sector or other sectors, how much have they had an influence on how you do the leadership thing?
Oh, some of them have been incredibly influential. I look at particularly some of the older men and women, um, and a lot of those actually are within the Indigenous community that are, friends and, the parents of friends, in my age group, um, have really led the way on a lot of fronts. They've led their families through some really, difficult times, a lot of change. But the one thing that has always been at the core has been like family first, community, and then, self. So, and for some of them, I think one of the ones that really still sticks with me was um, an old Islander fellow that I met up on Horn Island who had joined the war effort. And he was so proud of it. But when we asked him, like, why did you join? Why did you volunteer? This is before the referendum in '67, before, you had formal recognition, as a citizen of this country. And he said that he actually fought for one country, one people, one love. Sadly, he's passed now, but that really struck with me that his was a life of service to the people. And that really, that really, hit home. And I went, there's been so many people. My grandfather who came over, took the risk of leaving England post-war, and embarking on a new adventure, and then bringing out the family. And my grandmother who, blindly, not knowing what was awaiting for her. She didn't know that she wasn't going to have running water or toilet or power or anything like that. But she was, brave and had the courage and a vision and a hope in the future. And I think quite often that's what it is. It is that vision and knowing that things might be tough now, but we actually have a hope and a vision and a belief that the future will be better, and we actually play a contributing role in that.
Yeah, it sounds positive, Penny. And it sounds like these people have influenced you on the come up. And leadership takes all sorts of forms. It's not just in formal
Mm,
organisations or in the not-for-profit sector space in which you and
mm,
I have worked in. You're currently
mm,
working in. So let me ask you, how do you
mm.
define leadership?
Oh. So I think leadership is the ability to inspire people to um, have the confidence to actually do more. And being able to recognize that there is more within them, and they can actually, develop that. They can use that. They can exhibit it. And it doesn't mean that you have to be out the front all the time. You don't need to be the big speaker or the face of something. But everyone has something, to add and to give. And it's actually being able to create a space for people to be able to do that, um, primarily because there's a shared vision. So I think when something resonates with people and then you find a space And initially it might be just an inkling that you have, that someone will have a hidden ability, and you go, I think they would be great doing this. Yeah. And then inviting them, to be able to do that, or tapping them on the shoulder going, I'd love you to give me a hand with this. I think you've got, you can bring something to this that I don't have. So you're actually doing a lot of, I guess, matchmaking, and and it's like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. And I guess the leader is the one that actually starts the jigsaw puzzle off with the first couple of pieces, and then lets others start filling it. Or goes, oh, that piece doesn't fit there, but have a look. I think it fits here. So sometimes it's in the approach with the puzzle. And sometimes it takes a long time to do, and sometimes you have to start again because maybe there's a piece missing and you can't finish it, and then you need someone else that comes in and goes, I can see that piece, pop it in there. So but I think it's sometimes willing to take the risk, to pop your head up over the turret, and sometimes it might be the one that gets shot down. But doing it not because you need to be seen front and center, but because maybe the people behind you want you to do that, to lead the way for them, so that they feel that there's a path, that they can happily follow and safely follow. And sometimes you just create that space, that safety. And sometimes, if it's a bit of an unknown, it's, well, if they're going to put a foot forward, then I will too. Sometimes it's being able to give people confidence that, well, if they can do it, I can. And what's the worst thing that can possibly happen?
It's thank you for sharing that, Penny. It's an interesting way you describe it, the process of everyone mucking in to reach a shared goal, and that necessarily means you may not know every damn thing, but you find the people that can help you to get there, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Now, closely related to that topic area, and I'm interested to see what you've got to say on this, is leader capability. So it's one thing to have the definition there that works for you from your experience, and there's no right or wrong in that. Where do you see the most critical leader capabilities? Now, I'm talking for you because they'll be different for everyone that I've asked this question of. So there is no exact formula here. I've got a few things that are front and center in my mind that make for effective leadership. But in terms of those capabilities, what does that list or those things look like for you?
For me, it's about connecting with people and connecting people to each other. So it's all about the humans. It's all about the humans, but also about the fairly consistent processes. Things that the steps that are relatively easy to follow or clear. Sometimes it's the leadership, the ability is actually to see clarity sometimes where there's a lot of fog. It's actually be able to, decipher, maybe a way through that, something that might be a bit obscure, is actually to be able to recognize that, and, and maybe tread the path and say to people, I can see a way through here. Let's go. And what's the worst that can happen? We have to backtrack, and, maybe there's a cliff that I haven't spotted. When we get there, we'll go, okay, there's a cliff. We're not going to step off it. Right? We'll go back and we'll find another way around. Maybe we have to go down and across and then back up. We'll find a way. So I think, and it's, you need to be willing, you need to trust your own abilities to an extent that you inspire enough confidence, but you also need to recognize, guess, your own strengths and your own limitations. And your own abilities, and and either you either really hone what you're great at, and then bring in the people that that can fill the gaps, and what they're great at, and they're great at something else, for a reason. Just as you might be really particularly skilled or really inspiring in one way, someone else comes up and they start completing that picture. So I think it's really important not to get too full of ourselves, but you still need to be strong enough and secure enough and confident enough, that people will go, this is someone I can follow, right? But not with an arrogance, of I know everything and it's my way or the highway. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. It's like working, with animals and children. Like, fear, it might be a great motivator, but it's not the way to get things done, with goodwill, and the extra mile, and and to be able to help people grow and evolve and develop their own skills and take their own path. It's much better to have a horse that's willing to work with you and go mustering than it is that you have to work really hard to make them go forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to ask you for in terms of those capabilities and everything we've talked about to this point, from a rural and regional perspective, and you don't have to name organizations. I don't want you to do that. But definitely from a geographic perspective and from an ag sector perspective, which you work and play in, and I can understand why it's important for you. What do you see key leadership issues that are out in the ether at the moment that maybe haven't been talked about enough? We'll go with that instead of picking all of them. Maybe the ones that you think haven't had enough attention.
Well, I think there's probably two that I see. One is actually having a really long-term view of the future of the ag sector. And I'm talking not just a political cycle or a funding cycle or an election cycle. Talking about looking at scenarios 20, 30, 50, 100 years ahead. What will the needs, not just of our nation, but globally, what will they be? What's our role, in helping either, address that or help shape it, within Australia, and particularly in the north. I guess that's because that's where, my heart is, that's where I live. But Australia-wide, I think. And the other is, I think, nurturing our younger people, to be able to step up and, and know that there is a future in agriculture. There absolutely must be, otherwise the world's going to starve. And that's not a pretty option at all. But nurturing and supporting young people, there's some amazing young people in ag now, and I'm sure there's some more coming up. But I guess we're not identifying them early enough and supporting them or encouraging them, and we're not advocating on their behalf sufficiently, I think. And I think this is something that our ag sector, has always struggled with. Probably not so much just post-war, but certainly maybe from the 60s and 70s onwards, is being able to tell the story of ag. And quite often the way we approach it is about, how important it is to us. But I think sometimes the people who rely on ag, because they're the consumers, sometimes, the disconnect between, their needs and how their needs are being met by the ag sector, sometimes there seems to be a really big gap, and we're not telling that story, or they're not, or maybe the words aren't resonating with the way they understand stories. Things change, language changes over time. So, but I think if we're able to really connect with young people and nurture them, my dad was a city boy and all he wanted to do was go farming. There are people growing up in metropolitan and urban environments that do get it. We probably just need to maybe, we probably need to, recognise that it's not all that,
We're not all baddies here in the urban centres.
No.
In fact, I think it's funny you bring that up. It's something I've thought about for quite some time, and it stays, I think, in the leadership conversation that we're having, is how do you keep promoting and doing that storytelling to keep the connection between your world, the ag rural space, and people in urban centres. And I think the degree of goodwill is still there. The thing that sticks out in my mind is when we had that issue with the strawberries that were tampered with, and the visceral response from the community to help those farmers in the strawberry production space. That there's still a lot of goodwill, but that only goes a certain amount of way. And if you had to quiz city kids or city folk like myself about where their food comes from and what are the challenges, I don't think we have much of an idea, because it's just not something that is made real for us, not in education, and because there are competing interests, and I get where that is important. So everything you're talking about there about how do you keep pushing the narrative and getting that connection, as well as the other things that you mentioned about what is the 30, 40, 50, 100-year vision, that has a place. And I think some people are playing in that space, but I don't know if it's in as structured a way as I think what you're alluding to. And there could always be more done. And that's a gripe of all sectors. It's not unique, but it's definitely important if we're talking about food production. And you've just mentioned that.
Yeah.
And the other one about identifying talent young, this is a really interesting area for an egghead like myself who thinks about leadership far too much. Is how do you take this in the context of a business or a not-for-profit or in a sectoral space? How do you find those good people early, and how do you start giving them opportunities and nurturing them through? And there's all sorts of resource demands there that look, Penny, if you've got the formula for how to get that done right, there's $1 million check waiting for you somewhere, because I don't think anyone has got it right. But at least having the conversation is the starting point there. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of key areas and the rural sectors that really will help young people connect. And a lot of those are around like your community gardens and your gardens at school. It's just like, when, the banking, program was still within schools, there was a lot more probably solid financial literacy and understanding of how money works, than there might be now. I think, and that's not just
you are showing both our ages here. I
know.
remember that I got my Commonwealth Bank account through something like that at school, where they'd say go and save, and it's really wow. That took me back. Sorry to interrupt, mate.
So I think maybe I guess when you're listening to some of the the great entrepreneurs of the world, maybe saving isn't the be all and end all, but it certainly is important. But actually how money works and how it can work for you, right? So, and I think that's an important thing within the ag area as well. But one of the things I think that works really well within schools is, where kids get their hands dirty and they grow things. Right, and they see what happens, when a disease or, grasshoppers come through and decimate, their lettuces or something. So they get a bit of a first-hand understanding, and, the joy and what it feels like to actually eat something that you've cultivated yourself. Right, so you get a much stronger connection, and I think it's important that you actually have contact with, with the soil, from a health perspective, but also, understanding how food and fibers are produced. So I think they're probably some of the greatest ways. And if we could find schools, and there are a couple of schools and maybe some homeschool programs that combine literacy and numeracy, financial literacy, all with that exercise, there's really solid, multifaceted, multi-sensory learning available that really connects people, with their food and makes them understand we're actually part of the whole food chain. Our contribution probably doesn't come until, we put waste in the ground, or, we're either ashes or we're feeding worms. But, our contribution between when we're born and that time, can be helping others understand that we're not separate to the natural world and to, we are part of it. It's just that we're consumers more so than we are, anything else at the moment.
Yeah, no, I'm
So I think that,
100%.
and I think
100%.
through the education system so we've got lots of subjects that are very isolated from each other, and yet the world doesn't work like that. So, and sometimes we'll have, subjects where you can't see where the connection between the role of humans in the environment and as, growers and producers as well as consumers, we could find ways to actually meld those. So I think some of those subjects would then become more appealing. People would see where they're more applicable. Might be a bit like doing 3-unit maths and your teacher going, you can do this, you just can't see where it's relevant to you until you get to ag college and you're doing irrigation engineering. You go, oh,
Yeah.
I've got a vague
Yeah.
recollection of a formula. Oh my goodness, I probably should have listened.
Yeah.
So it is. It's seeing that connection and that relevance. And sometimes, it takes a while to work that out. So I think, our education system has a great opportunity. Some schools, and individual schools and independent schools have a lot more flexibility in being able to combine, those sorts of learning experiences. I remember, when city schools would actually send kids out and have an excursion and we would swap. They would come and stay with us on the farm for a while, and then we would go into the city for, and go to, and stay with them for a couple of days. And, just those understanding of different living environments. I often say to people who go, oh, city folk, they don't understand. I said, they have different pressures. They have different experiences. We need to appreciate and understand that just because we're not driving in traffic for an hour to then catch a train, to then sit in an office, doesn't mean that, their experience, those pressures, fill their days. So if we want to try and share our story, we need to find a way to actually make it applicable and relevant. We need to actually understand and appreciate, what they experience, and then offer them an opportunity to be able to, come and enjoy. And it shouldn't be, you don't understand. It's being, here's a great opportunity to enjoy what we experience. The highs, the lows, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because quite often the good far outweighs, the bad and the ugly. Most of the time, anyway, I think.
Words of wisdom there. You touch on something that I've done a little bit of podcasting on, and I want to do more of it in this space, in these conversations, is storytelling and the actual power of that. In fact, as we're recording now, on the 17th, I'll be dropping a podcast with someone who spoke to me in that vein around storytelling and the connectedness that we have to that, and everything you're talking about lends itself to those discussions. Do our leaders do enough of that? But again, with the pressures that we've got on at the moment, it's fascinating to hear you talk about how connected everything is. I think we live in one of the most connected times in human history, yet there's still disconnections out there that you've just identified, and how you bridge that gap or get some reconnections happening, I don't know, but there's a fruitful space there that is more than just leadership, but it needs someone to lead those kinds of discussions. And I'm not for 1 second saying that people in the ag sector aren't doing that. We've got finite resources to do some of this stuff. So unfortunately, prioritizing sometimes kicks in, and maybe things have been pushed to one side for very good reasons at a point in time. But anyway, we could go down the rabbit hole with that. But I do like where you took that, and I guess there's leadership needed at all those levels. Just let me ask you, while I've got you here, Penny, we've all been through COVID-19. Do you think it had an influence on the craft of leadership from your travels? Again, don't want you to ID anyone or any organization. It's more, What's your general sense of it? Are we has it taught us something? Are we still unpacking what happened through that time? Where's your view on that, mate?
Well, it's interesting for us because our small team has always operated remotely. So we've always done things over the phone, by post, with the advent of the internet, of course, by email and Zoom, and other ways of video conferencing and whatnot. So so for us, I guess our way of operating didn't change considerably at all. But I think seeing others that needed to adapt and change, they actually needed to have a lot more confidence and trust in their workforce, because they weren't able to walk through the offices and whatnot and have a look or go and ask them how are you going, or what are you working on today, or so there had to be a lot more trust. I think some people really stepped up and took advantage of the time to develop skills and experiences, even though they couldn't maybe physically go to things. They were finding other ways, and some people were just adapting to using technology with great gusto, and really embracing it and finding out that it offered all sorts of amazing experiences and opportunities for them to upskill and learn. And for others, it was still a little bit terrifying, and intrusive to an extent, because for a lot of people, their home space was their sacred space, their haven, and all of a sudden the workplace is inside it. But I think some people found it quite isolating, and then others, found that they were making connections using other means. I think those who had like a physical, connection and had, personal interactions with people prior to working with them remotely, probably found it easier, because they could imagine when they were sending something or communicating, how that person may be reacting, or what they would look like, when they were responding. I think people, like we are using this, we're going, this is great, because it's like you're having a conversation, and you are. It's just that you're not in the same airspace at the same time. So I think in terms of leadership, I think people needed to probably empower their staff a lot more, and support them in some ways a lot more, and actually be probably more understanding of what some of the external pressures were, because now they were seeing them having to interact. Some were had young and old families in their home that they were trying to work around, whereas before they could actually basically leave that and go to the workspace, and focus on that, and they could do it. All of a sudden, if they're working from home, they had numerous other demands, and they needed to try and navigate that. And I think some people found that they could be much more productive in, shorter, more intense periods of time. And that was great, because they could actually really then focus, because they had to, because they might have only had 2 hours, 2-hour, blocks or something, and then, kids or, elderly parents or whatever, may have needed to be the priority then. So I think overall, people in positions of leadership were able to adapt. I think so, but I think some, for a little while struggled with actually, almost letting go, and going, have I done enough as, maybe the team leader, or, the boss or the employer or something? Have I given them enough resources to be able to still deliver this? And what else do they need? And can we offer it? Or how do we offer it? And do our expectations, change and adapt? Can we still deliver our service or our products, to the quality and to the extent that we want to and need to? Are we still profitable? And can we still, employ people? Can we still pay them? Because I think that was important to a lot of people. And will our businesses survive? And I think the ones that did were the ones that were able to, really adapt. They could see opportunities where previously they may not have recognised them, and they could see skills and capabilities within their teams that maybe they hadn't had cause to recognise before. So I think, the good leaders and the good business owners and whatnot were able to, do all that during COVID. And I think what it's done is it actually set them up to be actually much more open to the skills and the abilities, of the people that they employed or that were around them as well. So I think they're probably a little bit more open to opportunities and recognising, what's good in people and what abilities they have.
Yeah, it's an interesting response. I can't disagree with any of that. What I didn't think about. It's hard to disagree. What I hadn't thought about a lot, and this is one of the reasons I do the podcasting, is to try and expand my own thinking. Is I, like you, have worked from a home office for quite some time, and I never had the thought that the outside of my office is my sacred home space. It's not to be work. And then there's the workspace. And what I think I found is when I come into my home office, this is definitely where work happens, but everything outside that door is walking or taking that trip from work to home, and home is a different space, and being able to physically jump between the two with some ease makes life a lot more interesting. If you're not if you're the kind of person like I am, I don't need necessarily to have a big team around me physically. I'm happy to work and get myself motivated. But if you're definitely the kind of person that loves to be in an office environment, loves noise and people around you and lots of stuff happening, COVID would have sucked. It would have been a really bad deal while it was going on. And I think, like you said, the very best of our managers and leaders saw that in their people and tried to find ways to give them a proxy for that until things got better. And yeah, could not disagree with you. Penny, I want to ask the next topic area, because it's something, it's a question that I ask all of my guests. The nature versus nurture discussion. Are leaders born or are they made?
Oh, okay. I think genetically there will be some that will just have some. I think, for some it is. It's in their makeup, it's in their personality to start with. But I think what happens is it's nurtured from a very young age, because children that exhibit interest and curiosity in things, if that's encouraged, then those who like to explore, and maybe take risks because they don't know what's outside, they're often the ones that seem to be the ones that will develop leadership, skills and capabilities. So that requires nurturing, and that requires, the adults around them to actually let them do that. Because sometimes, as parents, we can see risks and we can see lines and shadows that kids just can't see at all. And maybe sometimes, we want to nurture them, but we also want to keep them very, very, very safe. And sometimes that stymies, that curiosity and, that adventurous spirit. And sometimes, you need to be you need to be prepared for some broken bones and scrapes and scratches and, some hurt feelings and whatnot sometimes. And going, it's not going to be the end of the world. Hopefully, it won't be fatal. It might be uncomfortable, but it's part of the experience of, learning and growing. So I think there's a combination of both, but I think it's really important that, I guess, those characteristics are identified in children very early on. So you need risk takers, but sometimes they might need a bit of tempering too, because if they don't have any filters, that can be just as just as difficult to manage as ones who aren't as comfortable as, stepping outside where they feel safest. So I think, it's and sometimes I just think, sometimes some are just born leading the way. Sometimes, they're the ones that are climbing the door before they can walk.
Yeah.
They're climbing the screen door before they can actually, go anywhere else. They're the ones that are, maybe drinking out of the dog's water, instead of, going to the tap. Yeah, they're the
It's
ones that aren't maybe not quite as concerned about their own personal safety, as they are about finding out what's going on out there.
sure. And I
Yeah.
look after a couple of hundred of these conversations, I
Mm,
still haven't run into someone that said it's all of one or all
mm,
of the other. It's too easy, I think, to be black and white on it. Not that
mm,
I've met anyone that wants to argue it that way. I think, and this is from experience, that once you meet X amount of people, maybe there's a certain amount before your brain triggers this in your own thinking. I'm talking generally here, and I have no research evidence to back me, but I think once you've lived a bit of life and you've been in leadership roles, or you've been close to people that are very good at the leadership process, that you start to think, yeah, this can be nurtured in people, but some people get dealt a set of traits and skills and abilities that maybe you didn't, and so they had a marginal head start on you. But all that said, if those
mm,
people with those innate abilities that we all share to a degree, like we can all think strategically, we can all use our foresight capabilities, but what I mean by that is if it's not nurtured, or it's not identified, or it's not
mm,
encouraged, we
mm,
you could be walking by the next PM or the next president of the US or whatever, and you'd
mm,
never know it because they never got a chance to
mm,
take that risk, or at least given the environment to do it. So no, that's an interesting response, Penny.
mm.
I've you meet kids in your travels that do all sorts of things before when they should be walking. You think, wow, how did they make that jump? And yeah, that ability to temper risk taking is really interesting. And then my mind immediately went to the entrepreneurs that I've spoken to. That
Mm,
the really fascinating ones will say, I get people around me that stop me from taking the step over the cliff because I don't worry about the detail. I'm just thinking big picture
yeah,
stuff, and they're not seeing the
yeah,
danger in going a certain way.
yeah.
And look, it's not, it's never to stifle people's growth or anything, but I think um, when you talk about a nurturing environment, being able to
Mm,
identify where there may be pitfalls is important if you're going to develop people longer term. And I think that only comes from nurture. So if I had my
mm,
view on this expressed, I still think it's about a 70-30 or 80-20 split between um, uh, uh, being nurtured, which is the bulk of it, and then those that are born
yeah,
with it. Yeah, that's great, but
yeah.
without the nurture bit, you're never going to get anywhere. Penny, final topic area, and this is asking you to look back. Sorry, were you going to say something then? Sorry,
Mm.
cut you off. Were you going to say
Yeah,
something?
well, I think yeah, well, in that whole sort of personal and professional development industry that's actually booming and has and COVID really gave it a huge bolster. Um, but they often talk about the people that you have around you, like the five or so, particularly that you have the most time and that have the most influence on you, and the most time with. Um, you actually start to build and grow similar traits and characteristics and ways of thinking, and particularly if they're people that question, like Professor Julie Sumner Miller, that's how old I am, going, why is it so? If you've got people going, why is it so? So everyone's starting to go, why is it so? And you actually start asking yourself that question. And then the one that I love is like, why not? Yeah, why not? Tell me why we can't do this. Why can't we? Yeah, and until there's a really, really good reason, we'll go, okay, well, let's sometimes let's just jump, and other times let's plan it and see, and let's do some scenarios and what's the worst, and then what's the worst thing that can happen. Yeah, so I think but yeah, I agree that nurturing um it has the biggest impact on things that may be naturally occurring.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. Now let me ask you to a bit of crystal ball gazing here, but looking back on your career
Wow.
pathway, what would you say to a younger version of Penny about being a more effective leader if you could go back and give yourself some advice?
Mm. Um, ooh. Yeah, probably don't doubt yourself as much. Back yourself in more. Back yourself in more. Listen, and when your gut tells you, whether whether you say it's your gut or whether it's God or whether it's a divine sort of speaking to you, listen, listen, and don't be afraid to listen to it. Something for fear of maybe it won't work. Give it a whirl. Give it a whirl, I would say. And then the other thing I would say is earlier on, recognize that there are others, that do want to help. Sometimes you just need to ask them. Invite them and ask them. Sometimes people think that you can do, so incredibly capable, you can, do it all. So they don't think that you need help. Whereas, don't be afraid to ask, or don't think that you're inconveniencing them by asking.
That concludes our podcast for today. I'd like to thank Penny for sharing her insights with us and a really good look at leadership from that agriculture, rural and regional, remote Australia perspective. Our next podcast drops on Monday, the 11th of September, and features a discussion I had with Cliff Beach, a musician and entrepreneur from the US. Please drop a like or subscribe. Have a great day, rest of your week, and we'll catch everyone on the next episode of Talking Leadership TV.